I have the privilege of presenting our speaker for this evening, Daniel G. Bagby. I first met Dan Bagby when I was a graduate student in 1970. I was just beginning and he was just completing, I believe, your last year, Dan. And it was a very special time for me, and a couple of things that I remember. I remember that Dan was a missionary kid, had grown up in Brazil, and that was probably important to me because my mother was a missionary kid. And he was also a really nice guy, so I really looked up to him. And I left at that time, and I don't believe that we've seen each other in the 30 years or so since then, Dan. So how do I introduce someone that has had 35 years of experience since we were together at that time? Well, since the Wayne Oates Institute is on the web, it's an internet connected learning, I thought, well, the best way to do that would be to look him up on the web and see what I could find out. So I did. And I want to just share with you a few things that I found. The first thing that I found, and when I looked on Google, was that besides the family trees from the 1800s, and I don't know if these are your relatives or not, but I found several family trees for Daniel G. Bagby. I read that he had spoken at the University Baptist Church in Charlottesville, Virginia this past summer, and two of the titles that were listed, The Power of Secrets and On Behalf of Martha. I found myself fascinated and wish I could hear those sermons. It also said that his wife Janet lived in Richmond and they have two grown children, Doug and Bern. Next, I found a record in the Senate of Virginia Minute Book, dated 1996, prayer offered by the Reverend Dr. Daniel G. Bagby, Professor, Baptist Theological Seminary, Richmond, Virginia. Have you looked this up, Dan? Even his seminary webpage at the Richmond Seminary had a picture and this bio about the Theodore F. Adams Professor of Pastoral Care. Interesting, I grew up in Virginia, and when I heard the name Theodore Adams, I remember he was the pastor, beloved pastor at First Baptist Church in Richmond for years. And here's what it said. Professor Bagby came to the seminary from Waco, Texas, where he was pastor of 7th and James Baptist Church. He previously served churches in Indiana, Virginia, and held counseling positions in Indiana, Kentucky, and Texas. He has taught at Baylor University, Purdue University, and Southern Seminary, as well as Foreign Mission Board Journeyman Training Program. He is a frequent speaker on pastoral care issues and has authored numerous articles and 4 books. Actually, it's 6 now, so they need to update that. Lastly, I found most of his 6 books for sale on the internet. One was even on sale for half price. And they also had some reviews. Here is one on his book, Crisis Ministry, a Handbook, and I quote, "Topics covered include abortion, abuse, death and dying, guilt and shame, gender issues, hospitalization, imprisonment, birth defects, infertility, job loss, mental illness, panic anxiety, rape, stress, and suicide." Whew. You covered all of that in one book. And here it also adds, suggestions are also made about how to listen attentively, how to use prayer and scripture in caregiving, and how to set realistic boundaries in ministry. One of his colleagues, Charles Bugg, who some of you may know, who taught at Southern Seminary, wrote, "Dan Bagby is one of the most skilled pastoral care people that I know. When I read his writings, I feel as if I am having a conversation with a caring and trusted friend." That's high praise. And finally, I even found this in the editorial reviews of Crying Through Our Tears, another book. And guess who wrote the review? Wayne E. Oates, PhD, professor of psychiatry and author of more than 25 books. And that's wrong too, because it's over 50 books. And here's the quote: "Unique, imaginative, gets to the heart of human suffering that is assuaged by tears. Thoroughly documented with human stories about tears of many origin. If you must, sell your shirt and buy this book." Well, Dan, we are honored that you are with us and we welcome you, but if it's okay with you, I think we'll keep our shirts on tonight.
I'm honored and delighted to be with you and very grateful for this opportunity. There's so many friends I've known for a long time, some since 1843. It's delightful to be with you, and all the layers of relationships over the years make this even greater. I brought a one-page handout because it's always been useful after you've been somewhere when you ask, and what did the person speak on? Well, he tried to talk about this. So there you have at least an outline of a conversation in the book. Ted reminds me that my first language was Portuguese, and so I really didn't speak English till I was about 7 or 8, so now and then some cohorts and friends still wonder about the construction of sentences, but I had more fun because someone has said and handed me a note this week about people using English. It's the first language around the world, but sometimes they don't quite use it effectively. And I couldn't help, I hope I don't offend anyone, but here were 2 or 3 that came out. One of them was an announcement in a Scandinavian bar that said, ladies, please do not have children in the bar area. And in Bangkok it said, I should tell you, this was a cleaning institution. It was dry cleaning, and it said, drop your pants here for direct results. I can do better than this. The last one I thought was intriguing, and that was a travel agency in Barcelona, Spain, that said it meant, I'm sure, to attract attention and customers, but the large print sign in front said, go away. Haven't we all felt that when counselees came? Sometimes. Well, I am pleased and delighted to be with you. The heritage of many years are before me as I look at faces that are part of my story here. I remember when I was completing my master's degree in psychology in Texas that I wrote Wayne Oates to ask him if he would supervise me maybe for 1 semester. I wasn't sure if I could be at a seminary longer than that. But I was interested in trying to find out how psychology and religion could come together. And he promptly invited me over to Louisville, Kentucky, and the next thing he did was place me in the juvenile detention center, where I had a room. I lived next to the 17-year-olds, the Children's Center, East Chestnut, right across from what was then General Hospital. That's where I learned the beginnings of what it really meant to be a minister. And then as I sat with Wade Rowett, my compadre of graduate work together, I remember when we had a couples group in therapy with Swan Hayworth as our supervisor in graduate work. We were getting a little bored with videotaping couples therapy, so we decided to have commercials. Do you remember that? We had commercials in this videotape. We were almost flunked out for having done so. Walter Jackson, there are so many good memories of people who've been very special here. Thank you for the honor of allowing myself to be placed among you as not only a colleague but a friend. This is, at the same time, I think the first time I have ever been asked to speak after the benediction. That's how perilous it is, isn't it? So that we will not bore you then, let me just share with you something of which has been part of the dialogue we have together as we've learned how to care for people in their wounded places over many years. I have been a chaplain, I've been a pastoral counselor, and I've been a pastor, and I've been a teacher. It's the kind of thing Wayne Oates did with us. He used to say, when I get through with you, you'll be like a cat. Anywhere you throw you, you'll fall on your feet. And we've had many vocations in our calling, haven't we? This book came out of the journey, particularly the journey of being a pastor, where I was 16 years in Waco and about 7 years up off Purdue's campus at Calvary Baptist Church. I noticed how many different ways people cry, and that there was a language to the tears, and that there was such a variety in the pathos of that I decided to try to help some folks identify them so that they would enter the dialogue with a deeper sense of care and sensitivity. So that was what the book on Seeing Through Our Tears, The Language of Tears, was all about. Why We Cry and How We Heal was its subtitle. And they're probably giving them away if any of you want one, but here in summary are some of those comments, and so I thought I would offer them to you. I was aware that, socialized as so many people have been, particularly in a Southern culture, that some people have only been allowed to express their anger through tears at first. There were people, as I sat across a desk or as I walked down an avenue with them, who spoke with tears about the significance of anger. By then, I'd already written a book on understanding anger in the church, where I had tried to identify what so many of us already know, and that is that anger is not the opposite of love, but apathy is. That anger can be a form of care. And for some people, often it was women, the first way they could actually express their anger in an acceptable way was through the tears, which began the dialogue of the injustice in the world and some of the pain they felt. As you probably also know, behind so much anger there is both fear and pain. And so that for me was a helpful conversation as we started particularly a dialogue with pastors, but also caregivers as pastoral counselors, who sometimes preside over the initial expression of anger that can only find first a tear. One of the people who most impressed me with that was someone who had been sexually abused and had no other way to express some of the deep ire that she felt over having been used. There I learned, as in so many different places you have learned, something about the tears of anger. The second comment and the second chapter speaks of confession. Speak of it as guilt if you want, as our editors walked back and forth. Augsburg Fortress did this book. We tried to talk about tears of confession or tears of guilt, the places where within our soul we don't really have the words to say, but look for someone who will receive the pain of our sense of guilt or shame, the struggle we have internally, and understanding that that particular language is a very tender one, which is a sacred offering of tears. And incidentally, part of what I was trying to do in the beginning of the book was what Duke medical folks and other people had already done by identifying the significant role that tears have, first physiologically to the body. They carry away our toxins, you see. And so tears had a very significant physiological, chemical, emotional, and I believe spiritual function in the world in which we live. Not by accident, God has so designed that some of that significant physiological event is also a psychological and I think a spiritual one. Don't you think Wayne Oates would be proud that we'd bring those together? So, the tears of confession, because you and I are confessors so many times, regardless of denomination, we preside over the places where people come to terms with the moral struggle of their life and momentous self-encounters where they decide that they have done wrong or they have somehow crossed the line. And tears sometimes are the first way in which they get in touch with that reality. It's not the last comment, because I hope if you believe in tears, you also believe in grace that follows confession. Then there were the tears of failure. People who over years sometimes had given themselves to dreams and hopes, had worked hard for them, over them, and had come to the place where they were at their limit and had nothing else left but the experience of tears. I've sat with fathers and mothers who had dreams for their children and also for themselves, with individuals who struggled and given it their best and come to the places where they felt they were at the end of a journey and had to give up a dream. And sometimes it was first expressed with tears. I'm bringing coals to Newcastle. Everyone gathered in this room understands this kind of language, but it was another one I was trying to identify, because sometimes we come to the place where we have done our best, and before we can let go of places where we must fail, tears begin the conversation. Tears of fatigue. There I tried to identify not only the physiological fatigue, but the emotional fatigue and the spiritual fatigue. One of the experiences you and I share is understanding that people who take a journey come to places where they enter the winter of their discontent, where they enter sometimes the wilderness experience, where spiritual trauma and the emptiness sometimes of life has left them perceiving themselves abandoned. And there have been places where sometimes we are physically fatigued, but also emotionally fatigued and even spiritually fatigued. I've worked with the United Way agencies for a number of years in at least 3 different states, and by the way, every time I've worked with them, workshops have developed which now in the profession you would understand. I'm a clinical member also of AAMFT. We talk a lot about compassion fatigue. There are places where you and I, who give and give and give, come to the edge of all that we can offer and find ourselves empty. That's so often the case. I first encountered that with the social workers and other caregivers at the women's prison. Every person there has a crisis, not one, multiple crises. And those who cared for them would go through the listening, the sacred art of trying to help, sometimes trying to fix. And after the unending litany of people who continued to come by, there was the perception that they actually were burned out and had nothing else to offer. And sometimes wanting to give. I think folks off the Gulf Shore experience of the last few weeks and months probably know that better than anyone else. There are tears that come to us at the places where we're totally exhausted. But I've encountered folks in ministry who sometimes need to be recovered. One of the reasons we have a D-Men program that I've directed up in Richmond at our seminary is to recover, identify, and care for ministers who have been abused, who've been misused, who've been overextended, and who need sabbatical, Shabbat, who need a time of recovery, so that they'll discover, like Elijah did in the cave, that they're not by themselves, and that there are others who also need care. One of the significant insights over the years, by the way, in the life of Elijah, is to discover in my own life and that of others, how often we think at the places where we feel most bereft that we have lost our faith in God, when we have actually lost our faith in ourselves. And so often the tears of fatigue comes at those places, because there are places and times where people feel they no longer have anything to give, and therefore perhaps they are of no value. On with the tears of fear. As children, you and I identified that ourselves. I used to be, as a child, afraid of the dark. Now and then I confess to people, I'm still afraid of the dark. But there are moments where, in the midst of reaching our sense of dread or anxiety, you and I have brought first tears to the fore. And for some people to identify that has been helpful and healing. And so the chapter on the tears of fear had to do with identifying the many different ways in which we come to places and we are afraid. Biblical examples in each of these chapters give us some sense of the conversation of these wonderful folks who in the Bible make it come alive. The tears of frustration. There are places also where we give ourselves in focus to particular things and there deal with the reality that we have no control. I teach family systems back in Richmond, Virginia. So many of you probably also know that kind of dialogue. And one of the things we have to deal with often is some of the myths that people carry around, like they can control other people or they can change other people. But one of the frustrations in people's lives is how much energy sometimes people spend trying to change someone they can't change, or living in families where somehow they'd like to create some kind of atmosphere which they themselves can only contribute to, but not give a definitive contribution to. And there comes sometimes the tears of frustration. I've tried to divide these up in some ways, and as you would expect, as you hear some of these, you would say, but several of these are missing. If any of you have dealt with a book editor, you know that's why some are missing. They say this book can't be that long. They say you need to combine this and that. So there were tears of gratitude. Sometimes I had a chapter on tears of relief and tears of joy. Have we not also been at those places where the emotion from within that came and welled up and somehow took over, in the midst where there were no words, were the tears we had of joy or gratitude? I didn't want the book to be all about difficult tears. And so part of what I was trying to identify in 2 or 3 different places was this wonderful conversation in a language that had all kinds of different rich dimensions to it. And so that's why we spoke of the tears of gratitude. I was in Richmond at a hospital after an accident had almost killed the daughter and the mother alive in ICU. hearing the word and also knowing then that she too would be all right, first had no words to say, but found tears welling up in her eyes. The tears of gratitude. They're tears of joy. Have you been where I've been, where sometimes separated from family for 5 years or 30 years? We see someone we hadn't seen. I still remember the brothers who were twins, separated during World War II and only discovering each other or coming face to face in Philadelphia. Last year at the airport, a whole group of folks gathered just to see these two brothers hug and cry. Tears of gratitude. It's amazing what God has done with this valuable language that is silent but supremely important, is it not? The next one you have are the tears of loneliness. At 17, I left Brazil with my parents down there and came to the wonder of having no supervision. I could do anything I wanted to. They were 6,000 miles away. And I remember the excitement of saying, I don't even have to go to church. And I remember going to the first day of class. I still remember the smell of new blue jeans. That's what people were trying to use. And then I remembered the end of the day and the night, 2 roommates, and the lights going out. And my utter sense that the community I had was 6,000 miles away. The family I had was 6,000 miles away. Name the different particular circles of care, and they were far away. And that was the loneliest feeling I had ever had in my life. And I buried my head into the pillow so that I would not embarrass myself to my roommates because I was crying. Well, that's another memory that came back. One of the gifts my father offered me was that I often saw him cry, because there's some messages that come with tears. And so at the place where we speak of the tears of loneliness, I thought I'd also say, isn't it sad so many times that in the places we call faith communities, those are the places where people's tears are stifled. Big boys don't cry. Or when someone cries, I often heard someone say, please don't cry, as if we're helping, when what we're really doing is harming. We're shoving the feelings back inside. I still remember her face. It was in Waco, Texas, where his son is in the church. She came to me on Monday. She paused, came in the room, sat down in my office and said, you saw me in church yesterday. I came here to tell you you're not going to see me for several months. She'd been through a divorce. It was about 6 months ago. I said, can you tell me more? Oates taught us that, right? She sighed, and then she said, I sat there in the pew where you saw me, and I was doing fine till the second hymn and the second stanza, and it brought back some memories, and they just flooded over me, and I began to cry. And then she said, I think I could deal with my tears without any problem. I don't think I had problems with them, but the 2 people on the pew next to me were so uncomfortable with my tears, I'm not coming back till I quit crying. I hope you and I are ambassadors in the journey of life to help people release tears, because what we're doing is releasing the pent-up experiences and expressions and emotions in people's lives that are also part of the journey of the soul. And that's part of what I was trying to say with this book. Tears of manipulation. The women's prison wasn't the first place I saw that, but you and I have known and seen people who growing up have only been able to find or receive attention, to get care, or to feel that someone responds to them if somehow they have to manipulate or to seduce. And so often we become either confused or suspicious of someone who cries in front of us. Part of my work with marital counseling with folks was to help a husband sometimes understand that his wife's tears were not to manipulate, but to communicate. Because so many times we have become suspicious that any tear was a way of cajoling, controlling, or somehow seducing us emotionally. There then is the chapter on the importance of helping people who primarily have employed and practiced the experience of tears for manipulation, to understand that they don't need to employ that particular aspect of tears to gain the care and love and attention that they need. Things you and I say across a desk or down a hall or somewhere in people's lives. Tears of pain. You would expect again that first they would be the tears of physical pain, where people could no longer hold folks up watching the people from the Gulf, where people couldn't anymore respond to the people they wanted to. But you also know that there in the chapter is a conversation on the emotional pain that people feel. I still remember the tears of pain with this particular 32-year-old who was sexually abused and had begun to talk about it, and the pain in her face. I couldn't quite understand what was going on when for the first time she began to tell me about the sexual abuse she had experienced under her father, who was a minister and still active in another city in the same state. As she began to unfold her story, there was pain in her face and there were tears in her eyes, and she was crying. And I paused and said, you need to help me here. I'm sorry to interrupt, but something's out of sync. I read pain in your face, I see a smile on your face, and I see tears. There's more than one feeling. What does this mean? And she put her head down, then she brought it back up and she said, when he abused me, if I started crying, he would hit me, and I had to smile for him to stop crying, for him to stop beating me. And I understood there, among other places, something you and I have also encountered. How do we express pain in our life? Physical pain, emotional pain, spiritual pain. Those places and times when, with the psalmist, we feel the utter sense of abandon or the injustice of the world. How many times have I prayed with tears because I've seen things that should have been different in a world where I also believe God cries. Still remember the words of Henry Sloane Coffin when someone asked him, it was a deacon in his church, I think, his daughter had died, car accident, plummeted into the river off an embankment, and someone asked him, and where was God when that happened? And Coffin answered, I think God was the first one crying. There are times, aren't there? There are times where we cannot express the inexpressible except through this language, which is so rich. Tears of sorrow, you would expect that grief would come. You and I know it so well, the places where people enter the multiple grief experiences of life. I had the privilege of getting to know Rosalind Caraban over the years. She's a Roman Catholic up in Rochester who wound up writing a book called Complicated Losses, Difficult Deaths. She talks about the fact that so many folks walk through life with layered experiences of grief. There are multiple events of loss. Sometimes they're unacknowledged because we still have experiences where we've never identified the loss, or even sometimes church communities don't talk about it. It's the disenfranchised loss. And so in this chapter, I was talking not only about the experience of grief, but the multiple experience, which you deal with all the time. Your healing hands and hearts and voices are there. And that's part of this particular comment, that human beings have the unfinished business of so many sorrows, things they're letting go of, things they've never talked about. Somewhere years later, they finally release, and with that, their soul is released. And often it begins with permission to cry over something over which they had no control. There were more chapters, but the one I wouldn't let them cut out was the one entitled Where There Are No Tears. Because I wanted some folks to know that you and I know when there are places people want to cry but cannot cry. Because you and I have encountered human beings who in the process sometimes of having cried and had no one pay attention to it finally decided it was not worth crying. And so they buckled up and charged into the world, still hurting, but without tears. There are places also where people have cried so much there are no tears left, and they're empty. And there will be another time, perhaps, where with hope and joy they can also connect with the important language inside of them waiting to be reborn. But I wanted folks to know that there are appropriate experiences and journeys in life when people actually have no tears. And there are times when that is where life is. These were part of the journey in a book, part of the conversation, and behind each of them are several faces who are lives like yours. They're a wonderful and rich experience that was part not only of a juvenile detention center, where I listened to a 12-year-old dependent child in Louisville who was sitting next to those who had committed felonies and were far more savvy than he was, and he was scared to death, to the experience of the women's prison, to the experience of pastoral care and counseling. Jeffersonville was one of those. The experience of churches where people have taught me the grace of their trust. You have that too. It's the inner sanctum of people's lives, isn't it? Sometimes they introduce us to their life in the foyer with their tears, and then invite us back into the back rooms where we learn more about what life is all about. And where you and I sometimes have often felt inadequate. I'm remembering a pastor 7 years old back in Waco, Texas. I was not kidding. She was 7 years old, and a pastor who taught me much. She was a little girl, and so I wanted to conclude. There's always hope when any minister says, finally, right? Her mother told me this story because she would not tell me herself. But at age 7, it was the first year of first grade, and she with her best friend walked into school. It was going to be a wondrous event. They'd already been to kindergarten together and had played in the neighborhood for quite a long time. But when she sat down, her friend was crying. And then the teacher announced that her friend's mother had cancer and that the tests were coming back. Well, the little girl came home disconsolate, a member of our church. She didn't know what to say. She wanted to say something and didn't know what she might say. She felt so much pain for her friend. And so the mother began to talk with her, as any of us might. Here are some things you can say, some things you can ask, and some ways you can offer your care. Then they thought of something else. The mother remembered cookies. We can bake cookies. It's an act of care, isn't it? And so they put together a little basket, baked cookies, and the daughter took them in the little basket. Off she went on the bus the next day. The mother was so happy. There were some tangibles, some very specific, concrete things the friend could do. And so off she went to school. The mother could hardly wait. You know that feeling when you're waiting for someone to come back, and she trained on her face as she got off the bus, and the signal was not good. She looked troubled again. She was barely up the sidewalk. The mother met her halfway, and she began to cry. And the mother brought her in and said, "What happened?" She said, "It was awful, Mother. I came in, I sat down, I was going to say something to her. And she started crying again and just boo-hooed and just put her head down on the desk." The mother looked down and the cookies were still in her hand. She brought them back. She said, "The cookies." And the little 7-year-old said, "I put them down next to my desk and I was going to give them to her, but just then the teacher told us that her mother had died. And I didn't know what to say." They hadn't rehearsed that part. Mother's heart sank with the child's deep sense of failure. And she went on to add, "And so what happened?" And the little girl said, "Well, she started crying again. I forgot about the cookies, and I didn't know what to do." Her mother said, "I understand." But she wasn't finished. She said, "So I pushed my chair next to her desk, and I put my head down on the desk with her, and I cried too." Hey, now there's a pastoral counselor. She's 32 years old now, but I still remember what she did at 7. And you and I know people who walk into people's lives at the places where the tears begin. Sometimes it's beyond the words, but sometimes it's before the words, isn't it? And that is why you and I do what we do. I still say at the cemetery, I call it, where I teach. They pay me for this because it's a sacred function, and I'm grateful for it. And you and I are allowed into the hallowed places where sacred conversations sometimes begin with tears. That is what I share because First a man named Wayne Oates, and then other people entered a dialogue that made my heart listen. And you have blessed me and honored me with the privilege of this recognition. And it is actually a celebration of what God does in people's lives and the gift of your recognition that one person's doing it along beside you. God bless you, and thank you very much.